Hello, and welcome to In Pursuit of Clarity, episode number 45, entitled Making the Case for Separation. I'm currently in the process of finishing a video dealing with the extremely important subject of eliminating our total dependence on a system that seems practically dedicated to destroying us. It speaks to the use of dynamics like COVID or climate change or a centralized digital currency as means and methods to create a vast array of institutions and organizations, a sprawling bureaucracy, setting the stage to force mass compliance through a combination of the most powerful incentives and threats. There was such a mass of material that I couldn't possibly include in the video, so I thought I'd voice some of it here, and at the same time, make a standalone argument as to why I feel separation is absolutely necessary at this point, why I believe it's essentially the only path forward, why, if done properly, it managed to kill several birds with one stone and begin to help solve several of our most pressing and debilitating problems, and why I feel the handful of arguments I've been able to find against this course of action fall so incredibly flat and so miss the mark. So let's not waste any time and jump right into it. The whole COVID dynamic so clearly proved what so many of us had been assuming for some time now, namely that there's an exceedingly powerful faction, culture, or tribe of individuals who've increasingly managed to monopolize a vast number of positions of power and influence and efficiently engage in what's been called institutional capture. It seems they've recognized full well that the majority of the public isn't on board with regard to a great deal of their stated goals and the unstated aims they have subtly insinuated and hinted at. So their only solution, because they can't completely and comprehensively control or mentally condition the vast majority, they merely need to control the bottlenecks instead. In other words, you don't need to control the entire DOJ if you can maneuver your people into the topmost position or two. The same goes for the military, for various intelligence organizations, for the political arena. This is the only path by which a tiny minority can exercise dominance over a much larger number of people, while giving it a veneer of legitimacy and preventing open revolt. These individuals have visions of a future in which, quote, experts and a small administrative class utterly dominate all nations in an increasingly borderless and globalist framework, somewhat similar to China's power structure, which is why several leaders of Western nations, Trudeau possibly the least subtle among them, have so openly praised the Chinese model. And they've made such strides toward this that they can practically taste the unlimited power and feel that it's almost within their grasp. The vast majority of you listening know that this is a negative development, and that this future would be one of the worst of all possible futures. But before we move on to the rest of the argument, I think it's important to briefly speak to just how and why this path is such a net negative. Nearly all of the most pure and profound truths are things that are true on many levels. In other words, in a fractal sense, things that are true on both the micro scale and the macro scale. If a principle or idea proves true across many spheres, and from the most zoomed in as well as the most zoomed out perspective, this acts as the best of all proof that it is fundamentally true. And one of those all-important truths that we can begin to orient ourselves and our beliefs around with confidence. Many of these most fundamental truths are being aggressively attacked in our age. And this is, of course, by design, a very purposeful and conscious process. To give an example, consider that in virtually all of nature, especially with regard to mammals, there exists a male and a female, and the joining together of the two is capable of creating new life, to perpetuate all life on this planet, and to, quote, be fruitful and multiply. And across many species, mankind foremost among them, this new life is best shaped by having an ever-present and highly positive representation of both this masculine energy and archetype, as well as the feminine. Both provide something absolutely vital, And studies and statistics couldn't prove any more clearly that when a child lacks either of these examples growing up, they tend to suffer for it in the widest variety of ways. This family unit is essentially a microcosm of how a healthy nation operates. The father is meant to guide this ship with a creative and proactive hand. The mother is the nurturing and cultivating force that ties everything together, to unconditionally love her children and to create a healthy and stable home. Crucially, nature has wired both parents with a greater love and devotion for their own children than for the children of strangers, meaning an optimally efficient household is one in which the parents have direct blood and genetic ties with their children, because this greatly increases the amount of time and energy and love they're willing and able to grant to these offspring, to ensure they're shaped and oriented in the most healthy and robust manner possible. This new globalist ethos, with its attempted erasure of both male and female, and its celebration of multiculturalism, is like pure poison by comparison. Nearly every last aspect about these ideologies aims to obliterate this timeless natural order, and these timeless truths and principles. The "it takes a village" mentality, laid out by Hillary Clinton and her coven, amongst others, is in actuality saying it takes a state, and attempts to make the argument that our children are best raised and guided by a state and state institutions and employees, whether these be public school teachers, counselors, or doctors, or the television producers, or writers, or directors, or celebrities of prevailing popular culture. And not just a state, but a state stripped of everything that gave it any positive potential. A deracinated people who've replaced their sense of self, their history, their culture, their traditions and stories and myths, with brand new and novel creations spun out of whole cloth by the purely power-seeking in economic and political spheres, and of the purely degenerate and predatory in social and cultural spheres. So when you hear any variety of the "it takes a village" conception, one of the best analogies to fully understand what they truly seek would be in looking at their aggressive celebration of drag shows. This is a cultural institution of immense value to them, and one they believe should be shaping your children from their earliest years, forcibly so if necessary. And it's important to recognize all of these arguments being made for, quote, children's rights, and these increasingly common discussions about whether or not children can consent represent the first steps down the darkest of all paths. These are predators. Granted, they're weak and dysgenic predators, especially the men involved. And in the case of those like Hillary and her crowd, they're predators in pantsuits. And we don't innately fear older women, and they're certainly not what pops into mind when the average person thinks of a predator. But this is something of a mistake in this era in which we've so shifted from the physical and masculine and straightforward manifestation of dominance to the more manipulative and psychological form. These women, and the scores of men that so meekly follow and serve them, represent the devouring mother archetype, often deeply angry at the world, embittered, unnatural and disoriented women, who'd seemingly sooner watch the whole world burn than relinquish power to the forces they consider their sworn enemies. And it's not just children they're so poisoning and disorienting. This push to throw open our borders and mass import the third world has the most wild and enthusiastic support amongst our current power brokers. Virtually nothing could be more unnatural than this act of mass importing deeply foreign peoples. Just as a parent is capable of effortlessly loving and devoting himself to his own children, there also exist extended family kinship bonds, and these are natural, permanent, eternal fixtures of human society. We are quite literally genetically programmed to feel a greater bond and connection with those we share more in common with. We can rant and rave and kick and scream against this reality, but as we do, it'll sit there patiently, unchanging, unalterable, unmoving, simply waiting for us to come to our senses again. For this reason, nations have always, throughout all of human history, been defined as culturally and genetically cohesive groups who share the widest variety of the most natural and deep-seated bonds and commonalities. And when a nation fits this traditional definition, it yields countless benefits for itself as a result. There's a natural sense of brotherhood and mutual love and respect, which drastically increases the kindness and civility and hospitality, and spurs and inspires men to go to war and risk their lives to defend one another without a second thought. It encourages us to keep our streets clean and our lawn and property in good order, to abstain from crime and general misbehavior and mistreatment. It energizes us to want to do good for our community or nation, and to be willing to expend the time and energy to make this happen. And perhaps most importantly of all, and yet least discussed and understood of all of these reasons, it cheapens and degrades and weakens our language and our ability to communicate the highest and most profound and nurturing truths. It drastically lowers the bar with regard to artistic and creative standards. And I mention these as a single point because in a very real sense I believe they are. To try to briefly explain, without launching into a novel-length digression, any decent and reasonable person, as they communicate, attempts to intuitively sense the level of who he's communicating with, and adjust the message accordingly. To the extent that we fail to do this, we fail to meaningfully and fruitfully communicate. A foremost expert in the field of physics or quantum mechanics hopefully wouldn't use the same language when trying to explain his field to a young child as he would when explaining it to his own peers. Consider another example in which two people who don't speak one another's language are trying to understand and answer questions posed. They're likely going to revert to the most simplistic and basic terminology possible, often including hand gestures or facial expressions. And sometimes it's a miracle if even the most basic root point is fully communicated and understood in such situations. But if we think of the greatest works of art and literature, they exist above and beyond this most basic and utilitarian level of thinking and speaking. In a very real sense, they represent a triumph over it. It's because they've grown up with a firm and solid social and cultural and spiritual foundation, concrete and sturdy, that they're able to then take confident and wild Dionysian leaps off into the unknown, and potentially bring something back of immense and radiant value. Multiculturalism serves to destroy this solid concrete foundation, and slowly but surely pushes us all toward the utilitarian. In other words, if we're all wildly different people, speaking different languages, coming from different cultural and spiritual backgrounds, with vastly different worldviews and perspectives and goals and desires, language must, by necessity, descend into the purely utilitarian, merely to understand one another and keep things moving along without serious issue. Especially in the realms of entertainment and popular culture. A movie or television program simply can't financially succeed anymore unless it can speak to all of these wildly different demographics simultaneously. This happens so broadly and incrementally that it often goes unnoticed. But when a great writer sits down to create a new work, he's, of course, going to envision who he is writing for, just as any individual does in a one-on-one conversation. And as our nations become chaotic melting pots, he's far less likely to be as playful and creative and subtle and nuanced, and to push his native language to its absolute limits as he does so. Because he knows, full well, that a huge percentage of the population won't be able to get what he's saying. And I'm not simply referring to colloquialisms or figures of speech, or cultural and political ideas fixed to his region and moment in time. I'm suggesting that the true mastery of a language, the type that it takes a lifetime to cultivate and refine, has less and less of an outlet for expression, and the writer or artist has less and less a reason or pressing desire to express it. And it's not just the exceptional artists and thinkers who take a hit to their craft. It's every last man, woman, and child in the nation, as their entire language, and how it's most commonly used, begins to degrade. When language degrades, our thoughts degrade in equal measure. And as our thoughts degrade, so does our language, in a vicious cycle. And as a result, inevitably, our very lives degrade. So, to end this digression, I'm suggesting that multiculturalism is one example of just how poisonous and degenerative this globalist vision for the world really is. It's not just the rapidly rising crime rates, or grooming gangs, or the increasingly unsafe and dirty streets, or the near total collapse in cohesiveness and mutual resonance, but it's also very different lines of attack and deconstruction. Things like transgenderism, their attempt to play God, and sell this conception that nature repeatedly makes mistakes, and that only modern science, by irrevocably mangling your body and natural biology, can fix these blunders. It's things like transhumanism, their attempt to further play God in pretending that all things will improve as we swap out our physical parts or other elements and aspects of ourselves and become more like machines, with the most influential champions of these ideas now openly stating that the spirit and the divine are antiquated notions that science has triumphed over, that free will is a myth, and who are now openly stating their desire and aim to control all human beings in the most literal senses of that word. In short, every last aspect of their philosophy and worldview is unnatural, anti-nature, aggressively anti-spirit and anti-God and anti-Christ. And their ideas have caused several formerly first world nations that were once beautiful, safe, healthy places to be, to descend into hellholes. I'm suggesting this isn't a bug, but a feature. And they have no qualms with this, because at the end of the day, it's not a better world they seek, it's personal power. And even more accurately, securing power for those whom they act as willing and compliant tools in service to. It's also important to understand, their visions have already taken firm shape in their mind. If you pay close attention to the meetings of the CFR, Davos, the WEF, or the multitude of similar internationalist organizations, it's obvious that their foremost thinkers and philosophers have already fully charted this course in their own minds, and that all that remains is to find the ideal path to forcibly compel the masses to march down, to make it a reality. And they made great strides in creating this structure and framework throughout COVID, though thankfully a massive public outcry seemed to prevent them from going as far as they'd hoped in many spheres. But I believe the most significant push is likely still ahead, and likely involves the transition to a centralized digital currency and a destruction of cash, of smaller community banks, and of the vast majority of the cryptosphere in the process. I don't think most people, even still, recognize the full implications of this. If you think COVID restrictions were bad, please consider the prospect of not being able to buy or sell virtually anything to anyone at any time. Such a move would force the compliance of virtually every last individual. And as soon as we give an inch on these fronts, please trust me when I say they'll begin taking miles. Once this crosses a tipping point, they'll be unchained and wholly unrestrained in their push for power and control. Our finding a means to cease being wholly dependent on their systems and structures, especially for even the necessities of life, is the only way to dodge this bullet. They're operating a bit like a drug dealer, aggressively offering the first hit for free. Once you accept, very, very few will ever break that addiction and reliance, and instead will gradually become ever more deeply and fully ensnared in that web, creating numerous intellectual justifications along the way to save face and to ease your fears as to why it might not be so bad, as they demand ever more and you comply ever further. If they're able to convince people to inject a largely unknown substance into their very bloodstream, which has the power to alter their very DNA, what can't they do? What won't they do? But I've spoken to many of these threats and issues elsewhere, so let's even set them aside for a moment and discuss other reasons why I feel separation is now not just some viable idea, but a necessity. Firstly, what do I mean when I say separation? Several people, including some with influence and political power, are now speaking openly about things like a, quote, national divorce. And I think some of these envision this as a purely political split in two, essentially Republican and Democrat camps. Speaking personally, and I think many of you might agree, I don't entirely trust or resonate with this talk, and almost feel as if it's being offered up by a subset of the political class because they recognize that the energy is swiftly moving in this direction, and they're simply seeking to stay ahead of it, and perhaps thereby guide and orient it. Yes, a red-blue split would almost certainly lead to significant and immediate-term improvement in quality of life, but a merely political split doesn't go nearly far enough, and seems to me a half measure. It's not exclusively the political class of the RNC that's been so subverted, but this rot has definitely reached down into the voting public to some degree. A future with leadership like Herschel Walker, or the former hedge fund guy, Vivek, or even a Ron DeSantis, doesn't intrigue me and isn't something I'd be willing to fight for. When I speak of separation, what's in my mind is more akin to the model of the Amish or Mennonite communities, not necessarily holding their exact views, or holding precisely to their chosen manner of living, but conceptually and structurally similar breakaway communities. I'm also envisioning several different communities springing up, networked to allow for trade and mutual support and idea sharing, but each living in a slightly different manner of their own choosing. One might choose to be excessively libertarian in outlook. Another might choose to be more rigidly hierarchical. One might choose to organize around a specific culture. One might even choose to become something like an ethno-state. All of these should be acceptable. People should be able to live as they prefer to live. Crucially, I don't envision this path as a long-term solution in itself. I envision it being able to pave the way and set the stage for longer-term solutions. In other words, if we can get back to living in a relatively healthy and natural way, if we can begin to speak completely openly and truthfully without fears and have all of those difficult discussions we need to have, and if we can stand on our own 2 feet and completely break our dependence on this system that so obviously despises us, it's only then that we can effectively envision, let alone effectively work toward, powerful and worthy longer-term goals and ideals. I so strongly believe that so much depends on essentially unhooking this poisonous IV drip attached to our vein, represented by, quote, popular culture, the Netflix and television programming, the multitude of ideas and storylines and narratives communicated with varying degrees of subtlety in movies and music. The word poison is not an overstatement here. These things are, to our spirit and soul, what poison is to a physical body, and I think most of them are designed to be, and consider the implications of this, if true. I'm certainly not suggesting every one of these communities should aim to be completely Luddite in nature and swear off entertainment and technology as a whole. After all, they have to be comfortable and inviting places to be, otherwise we've defeated the purpose. What I am envisioning is higher standards, greater vigilance and awareness of the effects on the mind, body, and soul of the inputs we take in, and reducing our tolerance level accordingly. Exploring ideas like an intranet, for example, and that's intra with an A, not an E, in which a community could continually allow digital material to enter through the gates, as it were, only if it met certain standards, but all other content would be shut out. And yes, I'm very purposefully and consciously talking about something akin to North Korea. I'm talking about desperate times calling for desperate measures. The reason North Korea is often looked down upon, of course, is because in their case it's so obviously done for reasons of maintaining power and control over the population. Whereas in the case of a breakaway community with an intranet, what was allowed in or kept out might be determined by the community at large, or a carefully selected portion of this community, specifically chosen for their judgment. Does this mean an individual would be wholly prevented from accessing the wider global internet? Probably not, in most cases, but this would depend on the community. It may just be a setup in which it's culturally discouraged and frowned upon to spend too much time immersed in content that hasn't been embraced and included into the communal intranet. I can sense a few people perhaps bristling at the idea of being restricted, so it's important to speak to the idea that it's likely that not all communities would opt for such a solution. And for those that did seek to accomplish such goals, there are countless different ways it might be implemented. But I'd also ask you to consider the thought that perhaps imposing restrictions on ourselves isn't such a terrible thing. Perhaps being surrounded and bombarded by the most addictive poisons and degenerative elements virtually all day, every day, isn't the ideal way to live. Perhaps a narrower focus on those things which have the greatest chance to improve our physical, mental, and spiritual health is fundamentally superior to this path of endless novelty and this complete and total lack of standards. And it's not just psychological and spiritual poisons these breakaway communities could help us address. Never, at any point in recorded human history, have we been surrounded by more poisons and toxic metals and preservatives and chemicals with unknown effects in our food and water supply. Our ancestors drank fresh spring water, unpolluted and the best and most naturally healthy a person could possibly hope for. Many of us, by contrast, drink the results of a local water treatment plant. We take in high amounts of fluoride, now all but conclusively proven to lower IQ and produce negative psychological changes. We take in trace amounts of a multitude of prescription drugs, as a great many of these can't be fully removed during the water treatment process. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. Our cheap Chinese products we buy so freely are often made with materials that can have profoundly negative effects on mind and body, as are the clothes we wear, the soaps and detergents and shampoos we use. A huge percentage of these also contain endocrine disruptors and have a powerfully negative effect on our hormonal balance. Testosterone has never plummeted this far, this fast. The same with fertility, and I suspect something very similar is now occurring with regard to IQ. We've seen an explosion in cancers, in rates of autism, and massive spikes in so many other ailments, many of which were virtually unknown several generations ago. To summarize, it's no exaggeration to say we are poisoning ourselves, in a literal sense, mind, body, and soul. If there's one clear and obvious priority every human being should seek to have in life, it would be to avoid these degenerative poisons and seek health. This is a big part of what so excites and intrigues me about such a network of communities. Imagine fresh spring water available to all at all times. Fresh organic food, fresh fruits and vegetables, grown without pesticides and chemicals by individuals we have reason to trust without genetic modification. Grass-fed beef coming from healthy and happy cattle. Raw milk and cheese from cows without antibiotics. Chicken and eggs from healthy and happy free-range chickens. Quality clothing, individually tailored and created using simple and basic materials. No more foods with ingredients labels the length of a short novel, with scores of ingredients one can't pronounce or identify. No more daily usage products wreaking havoc on hormones or fertility levels. Imagine an intensive focus on collectively beautifying our surroundings and keeping this, as opposed to purely economic motivations, as a highest priority as we create and build. Planting new trees and flowers and engaging in competent landscaping could be seen as an art, not throwaway menial labor. And those with the greatest knowledge and expertise could step to the fore to help manifest this beauty. And the same with architecture and the design of our structures. Imagine our harnessing our collective intellect and creativity to experiment and debate to find ideal types of houses that represent the best balance between cost-efficient value, ease of construction, and the securing of materials, yet that are at the same time maximally comfortable and aesthetically pleasing. Thoughtful and considerate design in every last element of our living spaces, as opposed to purely economic utilitarian concerns. And a broader recognition that outward beauty helps play a role in the cultivation of inward beauty, and vice versa, just as a healthy body helps cultivate a healthy mind. Imagine being able to cease sending the earnings from your hard work to individuals and institutions that hate you and represent your polar ideological opposites, and instead know that you are directly supporting good people of like mind. Imagine new schools, ranging from children's education to college-type courses to apprenticeship dynamics, allowing us to educate one another completely free from the grasp of this failed, partisan, incompetent public educational system most of us have to deal with at present. And imagine the different caliber of students, and how much healthier and happier and more productive these learning environments might be. And eventually, imagine things like old folks' homes, staffed by individuals you have reason to trust, who have legitimate respect for their elders, and don't view their job as a mere paycheck. And eventually, imagine hospitals staffed similarly, that operate free from the incentivizing hand of Big Pharma, and are able instead to exclusively devote themselves to any and all paths and treatments that consistently prove most effective, regardless of profit motives. Imagine scores of different solutions to encourage physical activity and our spending a bit more time in nature, whether these be clubs devoted to long exploratory walks or hikes, fishing or sailing or kayaking, sports leagues, lifting and physical fitness, boxing or MMA. Imagine a network of communities that have so effectively eliminated the swaths of parasitic and redundant professions and occupations, and so massively increased their efficiency in the process that they're able to harness this vast amount of resulting excess time and energy toward higher aims and loftier goals. Imagine being able to consciously and proactively work alongside others committed to doing the same, to create new culture, being able to rediscover and return to old and timeless themes, incorporating the best and brightest aspects of the cultures who have preceded us, and finding ways to artfully cultivate these aspects and elements in a manner conducive to the present day. Imagine not being surrounded by people who have been taught to despise you, and mentally conditioned to disempower you and work against you at every turn. People who have been so deeply programmed and brainwashed that they've convinced themselves that their racial and cultural animosity is virtuous. And imagine simply being able to feel at home again, or perhaps for the first time, surrounded by well-meaning people who genuinely want the best for all around them, and are able to easily find reason to proactively seek out this best in all spheres. Finally, to help further clarify these ideas, and those I'll be voicing in the upcoming video, I thought it might be helpful to both pose and answer some of the most critical questions that either already have been posed by others in recent past, or might be in the near future. Question 1. Creating these breakaway communities, isn't this just fleeing the scene and giving up the fight? Answer. It does represent fleeing a crumbling and poisonous environment, yes, but it certainly doesn't represent giving up any fights. Putting up any serious fight becomes impossible when we are atomized and disunited, and unable to speak freely and honestly with each other, and work directly with one another. These communities would make it far easier and more efficient to put up any type of fight we see fit at any time. I strongly believe that this process simply removes significant barriers and obstacles, as opposed to adding new ones. Some communities may even choose to have the majority of their members work in outside organizations, as a means of helping manifest this change. These communities would simply provide us some officially friendly territory at long last. In other words, no matter what specific approach you personally feel is the ideal with regard to fighting this larger fight, I'd contend that our working to create such communities would represent a first step in putting us in a superior position to pursue that approach, almost without exception. For decades, we've been completely deracinated and stripped of our roots, our natural vitality and energy, and of course our unity and our ability to resonate on a similar, singular frequency. We need to walk before we can run, and up until now we've been essentially reduced to a crawl. To my mind, such communities would represent this walking stage, and yet may well have the power to someday transition into much more. Question 2. Wouldn't the members of these communities still be paying significant taxes into the broader system they'd no longer be a part of? Answer: yes and no. I don't want to get into the specifics at the moment, in large part because this isn't my area of expertise, and for that reason I wouldn't want to play a leading role in how we think about solutions here. But I am very much intrigued by the prospect of a barter system of sorts, and new jobs and occupations in which an individual might never receive money for his labor, but rather trade this labor directly for goods and services across this broader network of communities. To the extent that we can find ways to creatively do this that can't be easily attacked by the IRS or any related institutions or lawyers, such a dynamic might be a godsend. Imagine being able to earn your food, clothing, even your home itself, in direct one-to-one exchange for your work. And this is just one example. A vast and networked barter system has massive potential on so many fronts and in so many different ways. Question 3. A great many of us can't easily move, and even among the number of those that could, a significant percentage of these wouldn't have any immediately useful skill sets that might help build such a community. Isn't this an issue? Answer: this is to be expected, and hardly an insurmountable obstacle. Firstly, I envision that the first individuals selected, the pioneers, would be heavily drawn from those with the most useful skill sets, those who know how to grow crops, raise feed animals, create solutions for energy production and clean drinking water, those in construction, etc. After a time, and these necessities are squared away, those willing to participate in some apprenticeship dynamics in order to learn new skills might be brought into the fold. And from here, slowly but surely, we might draw from ever wider and wider circles. And, for example, those types capable of helping beautify our surroundings, of teaching, of positively entertaining or inspiring and energizing, and cultivating new arts and culture. And yes, a great many people can't easily relocate right this moment, that's correct, which is why I envision these communities being seen, in part, as a means of helping such types from afar, and perhaps creating environments some of these might be able to quickly flee to if absolute worst-case scenarios come to pass. For example, it's been said recently that various wargaming simulations indicate that a single major EMP detonated over the US could cause the vast majority of those affected to die within a mere 90 days. Such a happening is absolutely not outside the realm of possibility anymore, and I like the idea of our being prepared to save lives in extreme scenarios, including our own and those of family members. and our being in a position to cultivate far more fulfilling and productive lives, even if these specific scenarios never come to pass. Question 4. You've mentioned in the past that you see this as far more than a mere political battle, but cultural, even ultimately spiritual in nature, and that the spiritual element is the most important of them all. Yet, you don't seem to address this topic here. Why? Answer. Yes, these questions are the most dominant and important of all, in my view. I mentioned earlier how we need to walk before we can run. I think nowhere is this more true than in this realm. I feel we've been led so incredibly far astray, and not just by the Talmudic or satanic or atheistic element that currently wields such outsized influence, but by an obscenely corrupted church and church leadership. I see these communities as paving the way for us to find our way back home in these regards, but I believe this will be a process. Undoing decades of the most profound subversion and mental conditioning doesn't happen in the blink of an eye. I envision that these communities would slowly but surely develop and refine their own understandings, and that this might even be the driving purpose of many of them, and that, perhaps, these understandings might slowly begin to converge in the longer term. But I'm not sure any of this can happen efficiently until we collectively find the means to regain control over our environment and our information stream. I very, very much look forward to this coming to pass. Question 5. How do you envision this actually transpiring in a concrete way? In other words, if a fund was to be created, donations taken in, and land were to be purchased and granted or loaned to individuals, who would manage all of this, and how? Answer. These are definitely big, weighty, and multifaceted questions. Questions that I wouldn't presume to fully answer on my own, and questions that'll no doubt require quite a bit of ongoing discussion and debate. My idea is to create a structure that can facilitate these discussions and debates. A committee of sorts that would meet regularly, perhaps once per week, and perhaps even on a public venue like Twitter Spaces, for example, to slowly but surely flesh these things out, and even hold votes on more pressing questions. These meetings would be online only, at least initially, though perhaps down the line we might consider physically meeting once every 2 to 3 months for those able and willing to make the journey. I'd love to bring together a few of our most trusted and competent individuals to get the ball rolling, and create enough structure to where this committee could slowly build and manage and shape itself, ideally into the most efficient possible tool to accomplish the ends we're pursuing. I'll be speaking more about this committee idea in the upcoming video, and in at least one more follow-up audiocast, but I believe these discussions need to be held on a popular and easily accessible platform, and should act as the central element providing cohesive unity for both all of the individuals involved as well as all the ideas we discuss. And again, we're even free to use something like Twitter Spaces, because nothing we're planning or discussing here is nefarious in any way. Very much the opposite. These discussions and efforts should represent us putting our best foot forward with regard to anyone from the outside looking in. And this idea may sound strange, but it appeals to me quite a bit, and I think it's an important one. I'd like us to consider creating a simple website to accompany these discussions, in which anyone involved in the discussions might be granted an access login to simply register an upvote or a downvote to any and all individuals who speak at these meetings, indicating whether you believe they should be granted more speaking time or less speaking time in the future. The results of these votes would remain hidden to all but a small handful of committee leaders. But this strikes me as a simple means of keeping the discussion concise, efficient, fruitful, and on point in an ongoing manner. Question number 6. If controlled opposition and dishonest actors are as much of a problem as they seem to be, what's to stop some of these individuals pretending to be one of us and waiting for the ideal moment to throw a wrench into the gears and cause significant chaos, friction, or otherwise sabotage these efforts? Answer: this is one of the most difficult questions of all, and a question there are no simple or easy answers to. It seems to me the only solution is for all of us to fully recognize that we may well be rubbing shoulders with these types along the way, especially in early stages, and not to be paranoid and not to repeatedly vocalize such things or constantly make public accusations, but simply to be vigilant and aware and make optimal use of our own personal judgment and intuition. If we see someone that seems suspect, rather than calling them out personally and publicly, simply try to work against what you presume to be the manner of their specific type of subversion, and make use of your voice and voting power to minimize the impact of their ideas and their influence overall. This is a topic the committee I've mentioned should take very seriously, and any time we can build in simple means and methods to make sure the most trusted and respected individuals can reach more eyes and ears, and their opposites can be restricted to reaching fewer, we should pursue and implement these ideas, while keeping them as simple and straightforward as possible, and, ideally, ensuring that they don't cause hostility and friction and infighting. In short, this is a problem we simply can't avoid. We have incredibly powerful individuals and factions, and a massive amount of money aligned against us. And we certainly live in a world in which warfare has largely moved into this psychological realm. Simply keeping this in mind as we go, allowing this understanding to help orient how we proceed, seems the ideal path. Question 7. You know these opposition forces have a track record of hounding people to the ends of the earth to force compliance, or to impose their culture, or to prosecute any who stand against it. Ruby Ridge and Waco are just two examples of many, but the recent aggressive harassment of Amish farmers shows just how far they're willing to overstep. How do we avoid this? Answer: what I envision is that our stated reason for being would be simply to help those currently suffering and prevent similar suffering in the future, and to cultivate conditions whereby we might live in a far healthier manner of our own choosing, which is every human being's natural right. I don't think we should speak or act aggressively, or pick fights, or be a loud protest or activist type organization. If a fight is someday forced on us, for obviously unjust and tyrannical reasons, we'd have to cross that bridge when we come to it. But the alternative, doing nothing and watching all of this pain and suffering and chaos escalate indefinitely, is far more terrible by comparison. Part of our goal, as I see it, would be to make it crystal clear to all looking on, insofar as we're able to control our own image, that we only seek freedom from what we see as a wildly unjust system, that we seek peace, and that we seek to help. If a fight still comes to our doorstep, even still, here's to hoping we rediscover the courage and foresight and fortitude to be willing to fight it. Cowardice and inaction represents guaranteed destruction. This path, by contrast, represents some very real hope. And that's about it for now. If you have any questions, comments, or critiques, please feel free to share, publicly or privately. I plan to take a much closer look than usual at the feedback to these ideas. And the next video and the accompanying audiocast should hopefully make things a bit more clear. I hope you're all managing to find ways to be well under the circumstances, and thank you for listening.
This is the end, beautiful friend. This is the end, my only friend.